Fear is a vast emotion. Even though being scared is a universal sensation, what causes fear varies from person to person. What scares me might not scare you. Appropriately, horror is a vast genre. It's the only genre I'm aware of that has such sharp differences between its subgenres. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Funny Games are scary for completely different reasons, but they both succeed at inciting fear. Regardless of its subgenre, horror relies on tropes. There's the place no one goes, otherworldly creatures, possessions, murders, danger, friends not being what they seem, the list goes on. Part of the fun of having such a long list of genre touchstones is that they can be subverted or played upon, set the audience up for one thing and then twist it to something else, or play it for laughs. The possibilities are endless. After all, nothing in a horror story can actually hurt you. Alan Wake is a horror game, but its relationship to the horror genre is a strange one. Some tropes it adopts full on and wears like a badge of honor, and others it takes a somewhat counterintuitive approach. I love Alan Wake. It's been a personal favorite of mine ever since it came out, and I think a good part of that admiration comes from its marriage of the familiar and the unfamiliar. Even with a full-fledged sequel, there's still not much like the original Alan Wake. How it's a horror game that seems to not want to be a horror game. Alan Wake makes no effort to hide its influences. The very first lines of dialogue are,
Stephen King once wrote that nightmares exist outside of logic.
The town of Bright Falls feels like a legally distinct Twin Peaks. There's an in-universe TV show that's a play on The Twilight Zone. The game is constantly reminding the player of the works of King, of David Lynch, and of Rod Serling, all masters of psychological horror. For the uninitiated, Alan Wake stars Alan Wake, a once prolific author of crime thrillers who has hit a creative slump. He travels with his wife Alice to Bright Falls for some rest and relaxation, only for horrible things to happen. He wakes up in a car wreck, disoriented, missing a week, his wife nowhere to be found, all while finding pages of a horror story he wrote that is coming true before his eyes. The game deals in themes of fate, the painful act of creation, and how art can affect the world around us. The game is less concerned with making the player feel overtly fearful. Instead, it tries to get under the audience's skin, much like the psychological horror masters it so generously references. But Alan Wake isn't a horror game simply because of its story and setting. Gameplay-wise, it does its best to make the player feel uncomfortable, and it achieves this feeling through Alan's unique fighting style. In one hand, Alan carries a weapon that fires bullets. He has the usual arsenal of pistols, shotguns, and rifles, nothing crazy there. Except these weapons don't really do anything at first. The enemies in Alan Wake are covered in darkness, this fog that consumes them and, importantly, makes them impervious to attacks. The bullets will just get absorbed into the dark corruption. To make them vulnerable, the player will have to use the weapon in Alan's other hand, the one that fires light. Shining the flashlight at an oncoming attacker will burn off the dark fog. It'll take a few seconds and the foe will slow down for a bit, but eventually the darkness will dissipate, leaving the enemy open to Alan's arsenal. So the entire time the enemies are covered in darkness, Alan is defenseless. The player has no choice but to shine their light at the dude with the chainsaw and watch him inch closer and closer. Did you want to lay low and snipe the enemies from across the room? Well, too bad. You have to let them get close, but not too close. The idea of an unkillable enemy is nothing new in horror games. Part of what makes Pyramid Head from Silent Hill or the Tyrant from Resident Evil so memorable is how they're impossible to defeat for the majority of the game. All the player can do is survive the horrors. Alan Wake takes this idea, shrinks it down, then multiplies it. Every enemy in the game is invincible at some point. Alan can't fight, he can only survive. But not for long. This is the main hook of Alan Wake's combat design. Each of these enemies will have to be taken out using this two-step method, and this leads to some great consequences. For starters, this puts an emphasis on spatial awareness. The combat arenas in Bright Falls are compact, with few places to hide and none to duck for cover. The player has to judge the distance between them and their attacker. Will you be able to slow them down enough so they won't get within striking distance? Should you run away and get some more space between you? Or are you confident that you'll be okay? The player has to let the crazed, axe-wielding brutes get closer and closer. The feeling of watching a guy lumber towards you, with the light shining away the darkness, and just when it's almost too late, this is the moment the entire experience hinges on. So that's it. The gameplay of Alan Wake can be boiled down to a single moment, the feeling of having a close call. But of course, developer Remedy has to keep the game fresh for a multi-hour campaign, so they present that feeling in new and engaging ways. Alan will frequently find himself surrounded by dudes, so the player will have to make a lot of snap decisions. If two guys are charging him at once, the player has to decide which enemy gets the brunt of the light. I tend to find myself splitting my attention between them, bouncing from one foe to another in an attempt to buy myself some more space. But what if they're coming from opposite directions? Then the player will have to divide their attention in an even more extreme fashion. What if he's surrounded by 3 guys, 4, 5? Another wrinkle is that some enemies have more darkness than others, meaning they'll need even more time and space to become vulnerable. Yet another factor the player has to keep track of on their mental map of the playfield. The flashlight itself has its own limitations. Pressing the controller's left trigger will focus the beam, which in turn will drain its battery. Releasing the trigger will allow the battery to recharge slowly. Essentially, the flashlight is on a timer. In addition to having to guesstimate the time it will take for an enemy to reach Alan, the player will also have to hope and pray that their light has enough juice to last. If the battery runs out, the player will be unable to use it for a few seconds. To prevent this from happening, the light's life can be extended for a bit by using disposable batteries, which will give it a quick burst of power, buying the player some more time. These are a finite resource, so the player can't just use them haphazardly. Other enemies include poltergeists, which possess objects and vehicles. They too have to be defeated with the flashlight. Swarms of birds have to be taken down with the light as well. When the enemies are too close and too many, Alan can light a flare, buying him a few moments of respite. The flare gun and flashbangs can burn the light off enemies in a single go. They're great for large groups, but Alan can only carry a handful of these at a time. The basic combat in Alan Wake is all about managing time and space. Alan Wake uses its unique shooter mechanics to make the audience feel uncomfortable, to put them in these situations where safe spaces are scarce and close calls are frequent. But that's where the scares stop. Alan Wake is a horror game, but it doesn't really act like a horror game. Outside of its story inspiration and its combat, it flies in the face of many other horror conventions. Many horror games find scares in their settings: Resident Evil, Sweet Home, Luigi's Mansion. Exploring each room of a haunted house or town or wherever is part of the fun. Not knowing what lies behind the door is scary. There could be anything back there. Bright Falls is a nice, creepy setting, but there's no way to explore it. Not really. The game will place Alan in an enclosed environment with one exit. There may be little offshoots with secrets, but there's still only one path ahead. The story goes that Bright Falls was originally designed to be more open-ended and explorable, but Remedy found that it took away from the story's pacing, so it was reworked to be a more linear experience. And for what Alan Wake is, I think that was absolutely the right move. The story needs to hit certain beats at certain times, which kind of reflects its theme. The game's narrative is all about a horror story coming true. It deals in themes of fate, flirts with the concept of destiny and one's ability to alter it. As such, there are relatively few surprises. Alan will find a manuscript page that says what will happen before it happens. There aren't any subversions or jump scares in this regard. And speaking of jump scares, the game actually goes out of its way to not include them. If an enemy sneaks up on Alan in the forest, the action will slow down. The camera will spin around to show exactly where they are, and a music cue will draw even more attention to it. It alerts the player, allows them to mentally prepare for the fight, and then lets them continue. They didn't have to do this. I guess the game might have been more frustrating if they didn't, but I don't know, it might have been scarier. And for a horror game, the enemy designs are pretty straightforward. There's something to be said about normal people turning into something they're not, but there's also something to be said about Nemesis, nurses, Scissorman, or literally anything from Splatterhouse. Alan's health will also regenerate over time. If he can make it through an encounter, he'll be absolutely fine. This removes the need for any healing items or things of that nature. In fact, resource management isn't really a thing in Alan Wake. It's a critical component of the survival horror genre, but the game kind of ignores it. The disposable batteries, bullets, flares, and the like are finite, but only as finite as the game desires. Alan is constantly losing his stuff, so he more or less starts each sequence with the exact resources the developers want him to. If they don't want the player to use the all-powerful flashbangs, they'll get confiscated at the start of a sequence, and not hand them out until they want to. This might seem limiting, but it allows the game to give the player the exact amount of power it wants to. Of the base game's 6 episodes, I think the 4th is the best example of this. Alan starts the episode as a patient at the rehabilitation lodge, so he doesn't have any of his usual gear. When the darkness descends, he's given a weak light and a simple gun without many bullets to make it through. As he escapes the facility, he's underpowered. It sure would be nice to have a flare gun or a flashbang from before, but the game wants the player to feel small in this situation. Before he's able to fully escape, Alan will find himself trapped in this courtyard. His manager Barry will be on the other side trying to unlock the gate. Until then, he just has to survive. The player will be surrounded by too many enemies for him to take down with his current resources. It's a tense scene and one that only works if the player is underpowered. After this, the duo gets separated and Alan once again loses his equipment. He has to run through the shadow-infested woods, unable to fight the enemies head-on. But as this chapter progresses, Alan slowly but surely regains his arsenal, becoming borderline unstoppable in the process. Alan and Barry make their way to the homestead of the Anderson brothers, aging rock stars and local legends. They arrive at the stage on their property. Music blasts, pyrotechnics go off, and the enemies start coming. The stage is stocked with weapons, bullets, batteries, and flares. The enemies keep coming and the player keeps fighting, fully able to blast their way through the action set piece. He'll be able to mow down everything in his way. It's a euphoric scene and one that only works if the player is overpowered. So to keep the intended emotional responses to these scenes intact, the game carefully controls how many resources the player has at any one time. But a side effect of this decision is that it encourages the player to just use the dang flare gun. Go ahead, you might lose it in a minute. There's no sense in not shooting it since it can't be saved for later. The self-imposed limitations from something like a classic Resident Evil don't exist in Alan Wake. So with that in mind, is Alan Wake even a horror game at all? Sure, it has a horror-like setting, it's about a horror story coming true, it has gameplay that leads to tense moments, but it does hardly anything else to plant its flag in the horror genre. Or is Alan Wake secretly the most fundamental distillation of what a horror game can be? Since Alan Wake pulls quite a bit from the works of Stephen King, it seems only right to look at his hierarchy of terror, which stems from Danse Macabre, his analysis on the horror genre. According to King, there are 3 tiers to this hierarchy. The lowest is revulsion, aka gross out or gag reflex. This typically refers to shock value violence or gore. This is a reaction, a knee-jerk response to, revolting stuff. The middle tier is horror, which, according to King, invites a physical reaction by showing us something which is physically wrong. It's the response to something grotesque and unnatural, whereas revulsion refers to the reaction to something that can exist. Horror refers to the reaction of something that can't exist, yet does. And the top tier is terror, which refers to the anticipation of something scary, not a reaction. King references 2 stories, The Hook and The Monkey's Paw, where, quote, "We actually see nothing outright nasty in either story. It's what the mind sees that makes these stories quintessential tales of terror. It is the unpleasant speculation called to mind when the knocking on the door begins and the grief-stricken old woman rushes to answer it. Nothing is there but the wind when she finally throws the door open. But what, the mind wonders, might have been there." He goes on to say that while terror is the most powerful fear-driving emotion, all 3 are necessary and have a place in the genre. And yeah, while looking at some of the most iconic scary games, that holds true. Silent Hill 2 has its fair share of revolting moments. It makes the player react to horrible creatures at every turn. And it also makes the player wonder what lies just beyond the fog, or at the bottom of a staircase. Silent Hill 2 pulls from each tier, which is part of the reason its legacy is so enduring. I could say the same thing about Resident Evil 7, or Amnesia: The Dark Descent, or Five Nights at Freddy's for that matter. But I can't say that about Alan Wake. Alan Wake doesn't have any gross-out moments. Characters die, but not in exceedingly brutal or torturous ways. It's pretty tame in that regard. But at the same time, Alan Wake refuses to engage in much of the terror tier either, at least on a gameplay level. While the story has some suspense, the mechanics don't have any. Remember, the game will alert you to a new enemy's presence. It will lead you down a single path ahead. It will give you exactly what you need to progress. There's little speculation of what comes next, no anticipation of what lies behind the door. Instead, Alan Wake plants its feet firmly in the horror tier. The game puts something scary in the player's path, an invincible man with a weapon in hand and murder on the mind. And then it makes the player wait. It makes them shine a flashlight at the enemy while they inch closer. Even though their designs aren't grotesque, the way they behave and react to Alan's attacks is unnatural, and the player just has to stand there and watch them get closer and closer. They have to decide which enemy poses the greatest threat. In this regard, Alan Wake is the most true-to-form horror game maybe ever. It is only concerned with invoking one response. For as much as I love the original Alan Wake, I'm glad it's not too lengthy of an experience. The 6 episodes, along with the 2 bonus DLC chapters, give enough variety to the experience without any real padding. 2 years after it launched, a sort of sequel/spin-off title hit the Xbox Live Arcade, Alan Wake's American Nightmare. It finds Alan lost in Arizona, caught in a time loop. While it has some lore nuggets, mainly it gives antagonist Mr. Scratch some screen time, it functions as a standalone title. The biggest change American Nightmare makes is ensuring the player is empowered the entire time. The disposable batteries are plentiful. The guns don't have unlimited ammo, but they might as well. By making Alan more powerful, the enemies appear less powerful by proxy. And since they appear less powerful, they're less unnatural. And since they're less unnatural, American Nightmare feels even less like a horror game than the original. But the true sequel, appropriately titled Alan Wake 2, takes the core concept and expands it in every conceivable direction. This time, the game pulls from all 3 of Stephen King's tiers of terror. The game is gross, it's tense, it's uncanny, it's filled with horrible, terrible things residing in the darkness. The game is also a masterpiece if you haven't played it. But it makes a fundamental change to the original game's signature mechanic. The flashlight is completely different. In the original game, after using the flashlight, it slowly starts to recharge. The player can use the light pretty much indefinitely as long as they're patient and pace out their use of it. But in Alan Wake 2, the flashlight doesn't recharge. After focusing the beam, that's it. The light can be focused only a few more times before it needs new batteries that are much more finite than they were in the first trip to Bright Falls. It's a simple change, but it has far-reaching implications. Instead of making the player focus on the geography of the combat area, the player instead has to focus on lining up their flashlight and managing their resources properly. But if you miss, that's one battery charge you won't have in the future. In Alan Wake 1, the flashlight can only be used a little bit at a time, but no matter what, eventually it'll come back. The focus then is the specific encounter right in front of you, the horror of Alan's situation. But in Alan Wake 2, those charges are precious. So while yes, it's important to take care of the enemies in the room, there might be tougher enemies in the next. Instead of the immediate horror, it places its focus on the terror that might be around the corner. Alan Wake 2 is a horror game that acts like a horror game. It pulls from all 3 tiers of terror. We're living in an era where horror games are more popular than ever. From legacy franchises still going strong, to long-dormant series returning, to new and exciting IPs, to adventurous indie gems, games will continue to scare people in new and exciting ways. But I keep coming back to the original Alan Wake, the horror game that isn't a horror game, while at the same time being only a horror game. It all comes back to one moment, the moment where you're not quite sure if it's all going to be okay. Alan Wake, the franchise, understands that fear can come in many forms. It understands that both the known and the unknown can make the audience uncomfortable. It understands that true terror lurks in the spaces between the observable and the ethereal. But Alan Wake, the game, understands only one thing, that close calls are the scariest thing of all. Knowing that something horrible is happening and that it will affect you, it just makes your stomach drop. But then again, Alan Wake is just a game. It's just a horror story. And nothing in a horror story can actually hurt you. Right?